At 10:03 a.m., on a crisp Tuesday morning, a legal courier stepped into the 30th floor lobby of Sterling Capital Partners, a place where fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye. He held a thick cream-colored envelope addressed personally to Mr. Nathaniel Sterling, the titan of industry who ran this kingdom of glass and steel. But Nathaniel Sterling wasn't in his corner office, overlooking the sprawling expanse of Chicago. He was 5 miles away, tangled in the silken sheets of a downtown loft, blissfully unaware that his perfectly curated world was about to be shattered by the one person he believed he had complete control over: his quiet, dutiful, and very pregnant wife. The silence in the Sterling penthouse was a physical entity. It lived in the vast, echoing spaces between the floor-to-ceiling windows and the minimalist Italian furniture. It clung to the cold marble countertops and settled like a fine dust on the priceless works of art Genevieve had once lovingly curated for their home. It was a silence born of absence, a quiet so profound it screamed. For the past year, Genevieve had become an expert in deciphering the nuances of this silence. There was the 2 a.m. silence, when Nathaniel would slip into their bed, smelling of expensive whiskey and a faint floral perfume that wasn't hers. There was the 7 a.m. silence, when he would already be dressed in a bespoke suit, sipping an espresso, while scrolling through market reports on his phone, his presence as functional and detached as the smart home system that controlled their lights. Then there was the weekend silence, the most painful of all, filled with flimsy excuses about emergency board meetings or international calls that somehow always required him to be at a hotel downtown. Genevieve Sterling was not a fool. She had been a rising star in the art world, a woman with a keen eye for detail and an intuitive understanding of the hidden stories behind a polished facade. When she married Nathaniel, she thought she had found a partner, a man whose ambition was matched only by his charm. He had pursued her with a relentless, all-consuming passion that had swept her off her feet. He'd praised her intellect, admired her career, and promised her the world. But once the ring was on her finger, the partner had slowly morphed into a proprietor. Her career was gently nudged aside, deemed a charming hobby in the face of his monumental responsibilities. Her friends were subtly vetted and dismissed as not being on their level. Her life, once a vibrant canvas of her own creation, had been painted over, replaced by the sterile, gilded life of Mrs. Sterling. The pregnancy should have changed things. When she'd told him, her heart thumping, with a mixture of terror and hope, he had smiled. It was a perfect corporate smile, the one he used for the cover of Forbes. He'd placed a cool hand on her still flat stomach and said, "A son. An heir for the Sterling legacy." He hadn't asked how she felt. He hadn't marveled at the miracle of it. He had simply approved the acquisition of a new asset. That was the night the last vestiges of her hope had withered and died. The final piece of evidence had arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of the laundry machine. 2 weeks ago, while gathering his custom-tailored shirts for their housekeeper, something had fallen from the pocket of a Zegna suit jacket he'd worn to a late-night client dinner. It wasn't a receipt or a lipstick-stained napkin. It was a simple plastic keycard from the Peninsula, a hotel less than 3 miles from their home. It was dated for that very night. She had stood there in the cavernous laundry room, the plastic cool against her palm, and felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The frantic hurt, the gnawing suspicion, the desperate denial, it all evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. She wasn't a partner or a wife or even a cherished possession. She was a feature of his portfolio, the beautiful wife, the prestigious address, the coming heir. And like any part of a portfolio that was underperforming or no longer served its primary function, She was being neglected in favor of a newer, more exciting investment. That evening, she had called her old college roommate Rosemary, a woman who had seen her through every triumph and crisis before Nathaniel had deemed her too provincial. Rosemary hadn't said, "I told you so." She had simply listened as Genevieve's carefully controlled voice finally cracked the story of the hotel key and the years of silent neglect pouring out of her. "What are you going to do?" Jen Rosemary had asked, her voice a warm anchor in the storm. "The first thing I did after we got engaged," Genevieve had whispered, her eyes fixed on the Chicago skyline, the city lights like a galaxy of indifferent stars, was sign a prenuptial agreement. A document his lawyers drafted. It felt so unromantic. But he insisted it was just a formality, a way to protect the business for our future. And what does it say? It says that in the event of a divorce, I walk away with a one-time payment. Enough to be comfortable, but not enough to be free. It says I forfeit any claim to his business, our properties, his future earnings. It essentially says I was a temporary employee. There was a pause on the line. "That's a cage, Jen. He built you a beautiful cage." I know Genevieve said, a tear finally tracing a hot path down her cheek. But I think I've finally found the key. The next day, she had made an appointment, not with a marriage counselor, but with Audrey Hayes, a divorce attorney, whose reputation was as sharp and unforgiving as the city's winter wind. She had walked into Miss Hayes's office, the hotel key card in her purse, and laid out the entire story, from the charming courtship to the silent, lonely nights. Audrey, a woman with piercing blue eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, had listened without interruption. When Genevieve was finished, the lawyer leaned forward. The infidelity, while emotionally devastating, is often financially irrelevant in a state with no-fault divorce, especially with a prenup this ironclad. He will see it as a minor inconvenience, pay you off and move on. To truly fight him, we need more than a hotel key. We need leverage he can't ignore. Genevieve had taken a deep breath. "I have it," she'd said, her voice steady for the first time in years. "I have something from before we were married, a secret he thinks is buried forever, a secret that proves the entire foundation of that prenup is a lie." For the next 2 weeks, Genevieve and Audrey worked in secret. They were a clandestine team gathering documents, tracing financial histories, and preparing for a war that Nathaniel Sterling didn't even know was coming. Genevieve moved like a ghost in her own home, her polite smiles and quiet demeanor, the perfect camouflage for the revolution brewing within her. She was no longer just a wife. She was a strategist. Today was the day. D-Day. Divorce Day. She had woken up at dawn, the city still cloaked in a soft grey light. Nathaniel's side of the king-sized bed was cold and undisturbed. A text from him, sent at 1:47 a.m., read, "Deal went late. Staying downtown to get an early start. Love you." The lie was so bald, so lazy, that she almost laughed. He didn't even try anymore. She had spent the morning preparing. She packed a single suitcase with essentials, sentimental items, and the files she'd need. She wrote a short, clear letter to the household staff, informing them of her extended leave of absence and ensuring they would be compensated. She transferred the funds from her personal account, the meager allowance Nathaniel provided her, into a new one under her maiden name. At 9:30 a.m., she made the final call to the legal courier service Audrey had recommended. "Yes, the package is ready for pickup," she said, her voice even. "It's for Sterling Capital Partners, 30th floor, for the personal attention of Mr. Nathaniel Sterling. It's time-sensitive." As she hung up the phone, she walked to the vast window overlooking Lake Michigan. She placed a hand on her growing belly, where her child was quietly slumbering. For months, she had felt trapped a prisoner in this opulent tower. But now, as she watched the city awaken, she felt a burgeoning sense of freedom. Nathaniel thought he was the king of his world, a master of the universe who could acquire and discard people like stocks. He believed she was his most secure asset. He was about to learn in the most public and humiliating way possible just how wrong he was. The silence in the penthouse was no longer one of suffering. It was the calm before the storm. The sunlight slanting through the blinds of the loft bedroom striped the rumpled duvet in patterns of gold and grey. Nathaniel Sterling stretched a low groan of satisfaction rumbling in his chest. This was his version of paradise, not the sterile perfection of his penthouse, but the lived-in chaotic warmth of this space. The air smelled of expensive perfume, last night's champagne and sex. It was the scent of conquest. He rolled over, propping himself up on an elbow to look at the woman beside him. Victoria Vance. Her dark hair was a wild tangle on the pillow, her face flushed with sleep. She was sharp, ambitious, and utterly unsentimental, everything Genevieve was not. Victoria was a rising star at a rival investment bank, a shark in a designer dress who understood his world in a way his wife never could. Their affair wasn't about love, it was about combustion. It was a thrilling high-stakes game of shared ambition and calculated risk. With Victoria, he felt seen not as a husband, but as the predator he was in the boardroom. "You're staring," she murmured, her eyes still closed. "I'm admiring the view," he replied, his voice a low purr. He traced the curve of her shoulder with his finger. Victoria's eyes fluttered open. They were a cool, intelligent hazel. "Don't get poetic, Nate. It doesn't suit you." She stretched, then reached for her phone on the bedside table, her movements fluid and practiced. "Let's see how much damage the Asian markets did overnight." Nathaniel chuckled. This was why he was here. Genevieve would have asked him if he'd slept well. Victoria was already thinking about profit and loss. He mirrored her action, picking up his own phone. A cascade of notifications flooded the screen. Pre-market alerts, emails from his London office, a dozen messages on a secure messaging app. He scanned them with the practiced ease of a general reviewing battlefield reports. Everything was in its place. The world was functioning exactly as he had designed it to. He had no guilt. Guilt was a useless emotion, an anchor for the weak. He had a clear demarcation in his mind. Genevieve was his wife, the mother of his future son, the serene and elegant hostess who maintained the perfect home front. She was a vital part of the Sterling brand. Victoria was recreation, a necessary outlet for the parts of his personality that had to be suppressed in his public life. He was providing Genevieve with a life of unparalleled luxury and security. In his mind, it was a more than fair trade for his occasional indiscretions. She had everything a woman could possibly want. She had no reason to be unhappy. "Looks like we're going to have a good day," he said, swiping away a news alert. "The Fed's latest statement is dovish enough to keep the bulls running." "Good," Victoria said, not looking up from her screen. "I have a client presentation at 11. I plan on being brilliant." "You're always brilliant," he said, leaning in to kiss her neck. She tilted her head, giving him access, but her eyes remained glued to her phone. The gesture was both an invitation and a dismissal, a complexity that kept him perpetually intrigued. He got out of bed and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows of her loft. It overlooked a different part of the city than his penthouse, a grittier, more energetic view of the urban landscape. He felt powerful, standing there naked, the master of all he surveyed. He had it all: the beautiful, compliant wife at home, the brilliant, exciting mistress in his bed, a business empire that was the envy of Wall Street, and an heir on the way. It was a perfect, balanced ecosystem of his own design. He thought briefly of Genevieve. He should probably call her soon. He'd send flowers later, a massive bouquet of peonies, her favorite. A small, easy gesture to smooth over his absence. She never asked too many questions. In the early years of their marriage, he had seen a fire in her, a sharp intellect, and a passionate spirit. He had worked diligently, if subconsciously, to bank that fire, to temper it into a warm, predictable glow that would better suit his needs. He'd convinced himself it was for her own good, shielding her from the brutal realities of his world. The truth was, he couldn't have a queen beside him. He needed a consort. He had succeeded. Genevieve was now the perfect wife, beautiful, placid, and entirely manageable. "I need to use your shower," he announced, turning from the window. "Be my guest," Victoria said, finally, putting her phone down and stretching languidly. "Don't use all the hot water. I have to look like I got a full 8 hours of beauty sleep in front of people who know I was out with you until 2 a.m. He grinned. "Your secret's safe with me." He stepped into the sleek glass-walled shower, turning the water on as hot as he could stand it. The steam filled the enclosure, clouding the glass and insulating him from the world. This was his process. He would wash away the scent of Victoria, transform back into Nathaniel Sterling, the respectable husband and CEO. He would dress in the spare suit he kept here, step out into the city, and his two worlds would remain perfectly separate, just as he intended. As the water cascaded over him, he planned his day. A 10:30 conference call with Tokyo, a lunch meeting to close a multi-billion-dollar acquisition, an afternoon of interviews for a new head of risk management. It would be a day like any other, a series of calculated moves and decisive victories. His phone left on the marble vanity began to buzz. He ignored it. It was probably just his assistant Arthur with a routine query. He'd call him back when he was finished. He closed his eyes, letting the water sluice down his face. He felt invincible, untouchable. The king in his castle, blissfully unaware that a messenger was already at the gates, carrying a declaration of war he never imagined could be waged. The buzz of the phone stopped, then started again, more insistent this time. A second call from the same person always meant it was urgent. Annoyed, Nathaniel turned off the water, the sudden silence of the loft feeling strangely loud. He wrapped a towel around his waist and stepped out of the shower water, dripping onto the cool floor. He picked up the phone. 2 missed calls from Arthur Finch, his long-suffering and impeccably discreet executive assistant. As he was about to dial him back, a text message appeared on the screen. "Mr. Sterling, you need to call me. Immediately. It's an emergency." Nathaniel frowned. Arthur did not use the word emergency lightly. The last time had been when a fire alarm had forced the evacuation of their entire building. He sighed, a flicker of irritation passing through him. A crisis at the office. Well, that's what he was paid for. He dialed Arthur's number, leaning against the vanity. Victoria was in the other room, the sounds of a coffee maker gurgling to life. His perfect morning was about to be interrupted. "Arthur, what's so urgent it couldn't wait 15 minutes?" he asked, his tone clipped. Arthur's voice on the other end was strained tight with a stress Nathaniel had never heard before. "Sir, someone just arrived. A courier. They delivered a package. For you. Personal and confidential." And Nathaniel asked, impatient, "I get confidential packages all day, Arthur. Get to the point." There was a hesitant pause. "Sir, it's from the law offices of Hayes and Associates, and it was sent by Mrs. Sterling." Nathaniel felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Hayes and Associates. He didn't recognize the name. And Genevieve sending legal documents to his office. It made no sense. "What is it, Arthur? Some charity nonsense? A foundation proposal?" "No, sir. Arthur's voice was barely a whisper. "I've seen the heading on the top document. It's a petition, sir." The steam in the bathroom suddenly felt frigid. A deep primal sense of dread, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, began to creep up his spine. A petition, for what Arthur, he demanded, his voice dangerously low. The line was silent for a beat long enough for Nathaniel to hear the panicked thumping of his own heart. A petition for dissolution of marriage. The 30th floor of Sterling Capital Partners was a testament to controlled power. The air was climate-controlled to a precise 68 degrees, smelling faintly of clean electricity and expensive paper. The dominant sounds were the quiet, rhythmic clicking of keyboards and the deferential murmur of hushed phone calls. It was a cathedral of commerce, and from his polished mahogany desk just outside the CEO's office, Arthur Finch was its high priest of access. Arthur had been Nathaniel Sterling's executive assistant for 8 years. He was a man who prided himself on his unflappability. He had handled billion-dollar wire transfers with a steady hand, juggled 5 international time zones simultaneously, and deflected calls from scorned lovers and furious rivals with the practiced grace of a seasoned diplomat. He had seen Nathaniel at his most brilliant and his most brutal. Nothing, he thought, could surprise him. The arrival of the courier was unremarkable at first. A man in a crisp uniform holding a standard legal-sized envelope and a digital scanner. "Delivery for Mr. Nathaniel Sterling," the courier said, his voice flat, personal and confidential. "Signature required." "Of course," Arthur said, reaching for his stylus. "I can sign for him." The courier shook his head. "My instructions are specific. The signature must be from Mr. Sterling or his designated representative on file." "That would be an Arthur Finch." Arthur raised an eyebrow. That was unusual. Most services were content with any signature from the executive floor. "I am Arthur Finch." He signed the scanner, and the courier handed him the envelope. It was thick, heavy, made of a creamy, expensive cardstock that felt significant to the touch. The return address was for a law firm he'd never heard of, Hayes & Associates, with an address in a boutique building on the other side of town. He placed it on his desk, intending to put it with the rest of Mr. Sterling's personal mail. But something about it felt different. The specificity of the delivery, the weight of the paper. A faint sense of unease prickled at the back of his neck. Curiosity got the better of him. The flap wasn't sealed with aggressive glue, but simply tucked in. He rationalized that it was his job to vet all incoming correspondence, to prioritize what the CEO needed to see. He carefully slid his finger under the flap and pulled out the contents. The stack of papers was an inch thick, bound by a heavy-duty staple in the top left corner. The top page was a cover letter on the same luxurious paper as the envelope. "RE petition for dissolution of marriage. Sterling Genevieve, v. Sterling Nathaniel." Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. His breath caught in his chest. He read the line again. And again. The quiet hum of the office suddenly sounded like a roaring in his ears. He quickly scanned the rest of the page. It was a brisk, formal letter from an Audrey Hayes informing Mr. Sterling that he was being served with the enclosed petition and that all future correspondence should be directed through her office. Any attempt to contact Mrs. Sterling directly would be looked upon with extreme disfavor. He fumbled with the cover letter, his hands shaking slightly, and looked at the document beneath it. The official seal of the Cook County Circuit Court was at the top. The bold, stark words seemed to leap off the page. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." His mind raced. Mrs. Sterling. Quiet, graceful Mrs. Sterling, who always sent a lavish gift basket to the support staff every Christmas. Mrs. Sterling, whose soft-spoken calls he sometimes had to field when her husband was unavailable. He had always felt a pang of sympathy for her. He knew, as did most of the senior staff, about Mr. Sterling's proclivities. They were dismissed as the routine excesses of a powerful man. Arthur had always assumed Mrs. Sterling either didn't know or had chosen to accept it as part of her gilded life. Clearly he had been wrong. A wave of panic washed over him. He had to call the boss. But what would he say? And where was he? Arthur knew exactly where he was. He had booked the car service that dropped Mr. Sterling at Victoria Vance's loft building at 11 p.m. last night. This was a catastrophe of epic proportions. He looked around the office. A few analysts were glancing in his direction, their curiosity piqued by his pale face and rigid posture. He had to get control. He slid the documents back into the envelope, his movements stiff and clumsy. He stood up and walked into Mr. Sterling's empty office, closing the heavy oak door behind him, the click of the latch sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. The office was a monument to Nathaniel Sterling. One wall was a window, with a godlike view of the city. Another held a collection of abstract art that screamed of wealth and power. The desk was a vast, uncluttered expanse of polished mahogany. Arthur stood in the center of the room, the envelope in his hand, feeling like a live grenade. He pulled out his phone and dialed his boss's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Of course, he was still there, still in her bed. The juxtaposition of the scene, Arthur imagined the rumpled sheets, the morning light, the casual intimacy with the legal bomb in his hand, was nauseating. He hung up and called again, immediately. This was the signal. A second call meant it was an emergency. Nathaniel answered on the second ring, his voice clipped and annoyed. "Arthur, what's so urgent it couldn't wait 15 minutes?" Arthur took a shaky breath. "Sir, someone just arrived. A courier. They delivered a package. For you. Personal and confidential." He had to force the words out, and the impatience in Nathaniel's voice was like a physical blow. "I get confidential packages all day, Arthur. Get to the point." "Sir, it's from the law offices of Hayes and Associates, and it was sent by Mrs. Sterling." Arthur could hear the change in the atmosphere on the other end of the line. The casual annoyance was replaced by a tense stillness. "What is it?" "Arthur. Some charity nonsense, a foundation proposal." The denial in his boss's voice was almost pitiable. "No, Sir Arthur," said his own voice, dropping to a whisper. He felt like an executioner. "I've seen the heading on the top document. It's a petition, sir." He heard a sharp intake of breath. A petition for what, Arthur? The question was low, dangerous. The voice of a cornered animal. Arthur closed his eyes. He pictured Mrs. Sterling's calm, elegant face and wondered what could have possibly pushed her to do this. He pictured his boss, naked and arrogant, in another woman's apartment. The scales of justice, he thought with a strange sense of detachment, were finally brutally balancing. He delivered the final blow, a petition for dissolution of marriage. For a long moment there was nothing but dead silence on the line. No rage, no denial, just a profound echoing void. Arthur could hear the faint gurgle of a coffee maker in the background, a mundane sound that was grotesquely out of place. He imagined Mr. Sterling standing there, water dripping from his body, his perfect world dissolving like sugar in the rain. Finally, a voice came through the phone, but it was not the voice of the titan of industry Arthur knew. It was thin, brittle, and laced with a disbelief so profound it was almost pathetic. "Say that again." "It's divorce papers, sir." Arthur said, his duty compelling him to be clear. "Your wife, Mrs. Sterling, is divorcing you." The silence that followed was even heavier than before. The master of the universe had just been served, and the message had been delivered not to his home, not to his lawyer, but to the very heart of his empire while he was in bed with his mistress. It wasn't just a legal filing, it was a statement. It was a public execution. The words dissolution of marriage hung in the steamy air of the bathroom, seeming to warp the very reality around Nathaniel. For a moment, his brain refused to process them. Divorce. It was a concept for other people, for failed men, not for him. Not for Nathaniel Sterling, the man who controlled everything. "Get my lawyer on the line," he finally barked into the phone, his voice a raw tear in the fabric of the morning. "Richard Grant. Get him now. Conference us in." Yes, Sir Arthur's voice was a small, distant thing. While he waited, Nathaniel's mind kicked into overdrive, a frantic series of calculations designed to mitigate damage. Genevieve. How could she do this? Docile, predictable Genevieve. It had to be a cry for attention. A hysterical, emotional outburst. She'd found out about Victoria or one of the others, and this was her dramatic, clumsy way of lashing out. He'd smooth it over. He'd buy her a new piece of art, a ridiculously expensive necklace, promise a trip to Paris. He'd apologize with just the right amount of contrition to soothe her wounded pride. He would manage her just as he managed every other aspect of his life. "Mr. Grant is on the line," Sir Arthur announced. Nate Richard Grant's voice was deep and reassuring, the sound of eye-watering hourly rates. Arthur said it was an emergency. "My wife is divorcing me." Nathaniel said the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "She just had papers served to my office." There was a stunned pause from the veteran lawyer. "Genevieve, are you certain?" "That's what the multi-hundred-page document in my assistant's hands seems to indicate." Richard Nathaniel snapped his control, beginning to fray. "What the hell happens now? This is a nuisance. I need you to shut it down. Contact her, find out what she wants, and make it go away." "It's not that simple," Nate Richard said, his tone shifting from collegial to professional. "First, I need to see the petition. Who is her legal counsel?" "Hayes and Associates." "Audrey Hayes," Arthur supplied from the other line. Richard Grant let out a low whistle. "Audrey Hayes, Nate, this is not a nuisance. This is a 5-alarm fire. Hayes is a killer. She doesn't file for divorce unless she's planning on scorched earth warfare." A cold dread, heavier and more real than before, settled in Nathaniel's gut. This wasn't some emotional outburst. This was a calculated attack. "Just handle it," Richard Nathaniel said, trying to regain his commanding tone. "The prenup is ironclad. You wrote it yourself. She gets a payout and she disappears. That's the deal." "Let's hope so." Richard said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Arthur, get a courier. I want that entire petition on my desk within the hour. Nate, do not, under any circumstances, contact Genevieve. Do not text her. Do not call her. Do not go to the penthouse. Do you understand? She's my wife. She is now the opposing party in a lawsuit represented by very serious counsel. Every word you say to her can and will be used against you. Stay put. I'll call you the second I've reviewed the documents." The line went dead. Nathaniel stood phone in hand, staring at his reflection in the fogged mirror. He looked pale, haggard. The invincible Titan was gone, replaced by a man suddenly adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Victoria appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a silk robe, a mug of coffee in her hand. "Everything okay?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." "My wife is divorcing me," he said the statement, blunt and ugly. Victoria's eyebrows shot up. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her hazel eyes assessing him over the rim of the mug. There was no sympathy in her gaze, only a cool, analytical curiosity. "Well," she said, finally, "I didn't see that coming. The quiet ones are always the ones you have to watch out for." "This isn't a joke, Victoria," he growled. "I'm not joking. I'm impressed," she said, walking past him to place her mug on the counter. To serve you at the office while she knew you were with me? That's a power move. I almost have to respect it. Her detachment was infuriating. He wanted... What did he want? Comfort, reassurance. He realized with a sickening jolt that he had no idea. He had never needed comfort from anyone. What am I going to do? The question slipped out a sign of weakness he immediately regretted. Victoria turned to face him, leaning against the counter. What you always do, Nate. You'll fight. You'll throw money at it until it goes away. Her lawyer is probably some second-rate ambulance chaser looking for a quick settlement. You'll write a check, she'll sign a non-disclosure agreement, and in 6 months, this will all be a boring story you tell me over dinner. Her cynical assessment should have been reassuring, but Richard Grant's reaction to Audrey Hayes's name echoed in his mind. This is not a nuisance. This is a 5-alarm fire. He started pacing the small confines of the bathroom, his bare feet slapping against the cold marble. He felt trapped. For the first time in his adult life, he was not in control. Genevieve, his quiet, unassuming Genevieve, had seized it from him. She had chosen the time, the place, and the method of engagement. She had declared war on his terms in his territory. His phone rang again. It was Richard. "Okay, I have the petition," Richard said, his voice grim. "It's bad. How bad is she contesting the prenup?" "Oh, she's doing much more than that," Nate, the lawyer, replied. "She's not contesting it. She's claiming it's entirely invalid, fraudulently induced." Nathaniel laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "On what grounds?" "That's insane. She claims you failed to fully disclose your financial status before the marriage, as required by law for the agreement to be valid. She alleges you willfully and deliberately hid a significant asset." Nathaniel froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was impossible. No one knew about that. It was a ghost from his past, a skeleton buried so deep he had almost forgotten it was there. "What asset?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "A portfolio of early-stage tech investments held in an offshore trust in the Cayman Islands," Richard read from the document. "Established 2 years before your marriage. An initial investment of $500,000, which the petition claims with supporting documentation from a forensic accountant, is now worth an estimated $80 million. The floor seemed to drop out from under him. The blood roared in his ears. He had started that fund with seed money from his first major bonus, a speculative gamble he'd wanted to keep off his official books. It was his secret weapon, his just-in-case fund, that had ballooned into a fortune. He had never told anyone, not his partners, not his accountants, and certainly not Genevieve. How could she possibly know? The petition states, Richard continued, his voice heavy with the weight of bad news, that your deliberate concealment of an asset of that magnitude constitutes fraud, rendering the prenuptial agreement null and void. Therefore, Mrs. Sterling is petitioning for 50% of all marital assets, which her accountant values at well over $1.2 billion. Nathaniel sank onto the closed lid of the toilet, the phone slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. $1.2 billion. Half of everything. His company, his properties, his legacy. But it wasn't just the money. It was the violation. She had been digging for months, maybe years, while she was smiling at his dinner parties and asking if he wanted his shirt starched. She had been conducting a covert operation against him. The quiet wife was a spy. The petition didn't just stop there. It included a motion for exclusive use of the marital home, a request for temporary alimony that was more than the annual salary of most CEOs, and a demand for a restraining order, preventing him from moving or liquidating any assets. She had him tied up in knots before he had even known they were in a fight. And then came the final, brutal blow. "There's more," Nate Richards said, his voice grave. "She's filed for sole custody of the unborn child." While Nathaniel's world was imploding in a steam-filled bathroom, Genevieve was sitting in a sunlit corner of a quiet cafe, a place he would never think to look for her. She was sipping a decaffeinated latte, a file folder resting on the table beside her. She was the picture of serenity, but beneath the calm exterior, her mind was a whirlwind of strategic calculation, a state she had secretly come to embrace. The past few weeks had been a revelation. She had discovered a strength within herself. She never knew she possessed a ruthlessness born of profound betrayal. The key to her entire plan, the linchpin of her rebellion, hadn't been the hotel keycard. It had been a dusty box of old photo albums she'd decided to sort through one lonely Tuesday afternoon 6 months ago. She'd been looking for a photo of her late father, and instead she'd found an old, forgotten memory stick tucked into the back of an album from Nathaniel's college days. Curiosity had led her to plug it into her laptop. It was mostly filled with old term papers and grainy photos. But in a folder mislabeled Econ Notes, she found a series of password-protected financial statements. Nathaniel was arrogant, but his younger self had been careless. His password, she'd guessed on the 3rd try, was the name of his first sports car, Carrera 911. What she found had made her hands tremble. It was the initial paperwork for an offshore trust established with a $500,000 investment. It was dated 18 months before he had even proposed to her. She had cross-referenced the fund names with public data and realized with a growing sense of shock that he had invested in 3 tech startups that had since become household names. The value had to be astronomical. It was an asset he had never ever mentioned. When his lawyers had presented her with the prenuptial agreement, they had provided a schedule of his assets. It was an impressive list. Of course, his stake in his fledgling company, his stock portfolio, a small apartment. But this offshore trust was nowhere on it. At first, she'd felt a fresh wave of hurt. The lie was so deep, so foundational. He hadn't just cheated on her during their marriage. He had defrauded her before it even began. He had built their entire life together on a lie, ensuring that even if she dedicated her life to him, she would never be a true partner, merely a well-compensated contractor with no claim to the real fruits of the empire she helped him build through her social and emotional labor. But then the hurt had crystallized into something else: anger. A cold, clear, righteous anger. This lie was her leverage. This was the key to the gilded cage. Her first meeting with Audrey Hayes had confirmed it. When she'd presented the files from the memory stick, the lawyer's eyes had lit up with a predatory gleam. "This is it," Audrey had said, a rare, thin smile on her lips. "This isn't just a key, Mrs. Sterling. This is a stick of dynamite. His failure to disclose this invalidates the entire agreement. It's not just a breach, it's fraud. A judge will see this as a deception from the very beginning. We don't have to fight him over the scraps he offered you in the prenup. We can fight him for half of everything." From that day on, Genevieve had transformed. Under Audrey's guidance, she became a meticulous researcher. She hired a forensic accountant, a quiet man named Mr. Davies, who had been delighted to sink his teeth into Nathaniel's labyrinthine finances. Together they had built their case brick by painstaking brick, all while Genevieve played the part of the oblivious pregnant wife. She had learned to hide her search histories, to use encrypted emails to pay for services from a secret bank account she funded, by selling a pair of diamond earrings Nathaniel had given her, an irony she savored. Every polite smile she gave her husband, every time she packed his bag for a business trip, every night she lay alone in their bed, she was fueling her resolve. She was no longer a victim of his deception. She was the architect of his downfall. The decision to serve him at the office had been hers alone. Audrey had suggested a more conventional serving at the penthouse. No, Genevieve had said, her voice firm. He needs to be hit where he is most powerful and where he is most vulnerable. He sees his business as his fortress. And I know where he is on Monday nights. I want the papers to arrive while he's in her bed. I want his professional world and his secret world to collide in the most public way possible. I want him to know that I see all of him and I am not afraid. Audrey had simply nodded, a look of profound respect in her eyes. Now, sitting in the cafe, Genevieve checked her watch. 10:45 a.m. By now he would know. The shockwave would have hit. The frantic calls to his lawyer would have been made. His carefully constructed world would have a hairline fracture running straight through it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Audrey. He knows. Richard Grant has been blowing up my office. They are panicking. Stand firm. Do not answer any calls from him or his family. You are in control. A deep, shuddering breath escaped her. It was done. The first move in a war she had been planning for months had been executed flawlessly. She felt a tremor of fear, a natural reaction to taking on a man as powerful as Nathaniel. But it was overshadowed by a profound sense of empowerment. She was not the fragile, dependent woman he had tried to mold her into. She was the woman who had unearthed his deepest secret and was now using it to reclaim her life and secure the future of her child. She thought of Victoria Vance. She felt no animosity towards the woman. Victoria was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was Nathaniel's arrogance, his belief that people were merely instruments for his use. Victoria, in her own way, was probably using him too. They deserved each other. Genevieve took one last sip of her latte and stood up, leaving a generous tip on the table. She walked out of the cafe and into the bustling city streets. The people rushing by had no idea that a quiet war had just been declared in the towers of wealth above them. For the first time in years, Genevieve didn't feel small or invisible in the shadow of her husband's empire. She felt like she was a part of the city's vibrant, thrumming energy. She was no longer Genevieve Sterling, the appendage. She was Genevieve Ainsworth, her maiden name, a name that felt like coming home. She was a mother-to-be, a fighter, and a free woman. The battle was just beginning, but she had already won the most important victory she had found herself again. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air had given way to the biting cold of a Chicago winter. The city was dusted with a fine layer of snow, making the world seem quieter, cleaner. Genevieve stood in the nursery of her new home, a charming, light-filled brownstone in Lincoln Park that she had bought with the first disbursement from her settlement. The divorce had not been a prolonged, ugly war. It had been a swift, brutal surrender. Faced with undeniable proof of fraud, Nathaniel's legal team had folded almost immediately. Richard Grant, knowing a public court battle would not only expose Nathaniel's deception, but also likely trigger a review by the SEC, had advised his client to settle. The spectacle of a billionaire being exposed as a fraud who had cheated on his pregnant wife was not a story Sterling Capital Partners wanted on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The negotiations were swift. Nathaniel, humbled and furious, had no choice but to agree to terms that were once unthinkable. Genevieve received a settlement so substantial it guaranteed not only her own financial independence for the rest of her life, but that of her child and her child's children. She had insisted on the Lincoln Park brownstone, the penthouse holding too many ghosts. She was granted sole custody of their child, with a structured and supervised visitation schedule for Nathaniel contingent on his behavior. She had won, on every single front. The final meeting to sign the papers had taken place in Audrey Hayes's sterile conference room. Nathaniel had looked diminished. The swagger was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion. He had lost weight. He hadn't looked at her once during the entire proceeding, his eyes fixed on the documents his hand signed, transferring vast sums of his fortune and control over his legacy to her. When it was over, he had walked out without a word. She later heard through the grapevine of gossip that Victoria Vance had left him weeks after the divorce was filed. A weakened king was of no use to her. His company's board had also forced him to step down as CEO, moving him to a chairman role with limited power, a consequence of the scandal's fallout. His empire was still standing, but its emperor had been dethroned. Genevieve placed a hand on her belly, now large and round. Her daughter, whom she had already decided to name Hope, kicked gently as if in response. The nursery was painted a soft, sunny yellow. A mobile of hand-carved wooden animals hung over the crib. It was a room filled with peace and anticipation, a world away from the cold, silent museum she had once called home. Rosemary was there, helping her hang a small framed watercolor of a field of wildflowers. "How does it feel?" Rosemary asked, stepping back to admire their work. To be on the other side of it all, Genevieve looked around the room, at the life she was building, a life based not on acquisition, but on love. "It feels quiet," she said, a small smile on her face. "But it's a good quiet. It's the quiet of a house that's waiting for laughter." She sometimes thought of Nathaniel not with anger or bitterness anymore, but with a kind of detached pity. He had been so obsessed with building a legacy of wealth and power that he had failed to build a life. He had collected things, companies, properties, art, even a wife, but he had never truly valued them. His legacy, he was now learning, was not the number in his bank account, but the consequences of his actions. He had his fortune, but he had lost his family before it had even begun. Her legacy, she thought, was right here, in this peaceful room, in the gentle kick of her unborn child. It wouldn't be a legacy etched onto the sides of buildings, but one written in bedtime stories and first steps. A package had arrived for her that morning. It was from a gallery she used to work with. Inside was a small, beautiful sculpture by an emerging artist she had championed years ago. The note simply read, "We heard you were back." The art world missed you. She had cried not from sadness, but from a profound sense of return. The life she had given up was slowly, piece by piece, coming back to her, and it was weaving itself into the new life she was creating. She was not just a mother-to-be. She was a curator, an investor in beauty and talent, a friend, a woman standing on her own 2 feet. Nathaniel had thought he was taking a calculated risk, managing his assets and his women in separate, neat columns. But he had made one fatal miscalculation. He had never truly looked at his wife. He had seen a beautiful, placid object he owned, and in doing so had missed the intelligent, resilient, and formidable woman who was simply waiting for the right moment to burn his kingdom to the ground and build a better one for herself from the ashes. As the winter sun streamed through the nursery window, Genevieve knew with absolute certainty that her future was infinitely brighter, and her legacy infinitely richer than the one she had left behind. That's the incredible story of how one woman, pushed to the edge, refused to be a footnote in her husband's life story, and instead became the author of her own. It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet, meticulous planning that brings an empire to its knees. Genevieve didn't just walk away. She reclaimed her power, her identity, and her future, proving that underestimating the person beside you can be the most costly mistake of all. What do you think of Genevieve's strategy? Was it a masterclass in justice or a cold, calculated revenge? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story moved, you please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who loves a story of triumph and empowerment. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another real-life drama. Thanks for listening.